Welcome to day 8 of the challenge. Yesterday we talked about passing parameters, and today you will learn a lot of stuff about HTTP status codes and error handling. While browsing the internet, you have probably seen a lot of the 404 not found error pages. 404 is an HTTP status code. The server tells the client that what the client has requested is not found on the server. Some websites display a not found message to their users in such situations. HTTP status codes are generally returned from servers. In general, HTTP status codes are returned from servers and they provide generally agreed upon categorization to possible responses from the servers. They tell the client what category the response is in. The client then knows how to deal with this response based on the category. So status codes provide commonly known additional information about the response. HTTP status codes are 3-digit integers. The first digit indicates the class or category of the response. There are 5 classes of HTTP status codes in total. The ones that are starting by 1 are informational. An informational response indicates that the server has accepted the request and the client should continue with the request. The status codes, which start with 2, indicate success. It means that the server understood and accepted the request. For example, 200 status codes in responses to HTTP GET requests mean that the response is in the message body, so the client knows where to find the requested data. The third category is redirection. They indicate that the client must take additional actions to complete the requests. The last 2 classes of response codes are returned when errors or exceptions occur. The status code, which starts by 4, indicates that an error has happened and the problem seems to be caused by the client. 400, for example, indicates a so-called bad request, which is not processable by the server. When a validation error occurs on the server side, for example, we usually return the 400 status code. And the error codes starting with a 5 are usually those who get returned from the server as he fails to fulfill the request. So 500, for example, should be returned when an internal server error occurs. During this course, we are going to deal with the most important HTTP status codes in action. So now you know the most basic information about status codes, which will help you become the best possible web developer. Now, let's see all of that in action in the next video. Welcome to this video. Let's take a look on some status codes. Simply go ahead and start the application. Now go ahead and use your ASP port, then /swagger and /index.html. Now you get to that Swagger documentation, right? Go ahead and open up /flight. Now click on tryout, execute, and we get, well, a lot of response or flights here. And let's take just a simple ID here. Let's copy it. Let me just close that. Get to the flight endpoint and try it out and paste it in here and hit execute. Now everything seems to be working fine here, right? We got that code 200, which means it's valid, it's successful, and we can find the response in the body, which is that one here. Now what happens if we go ahead and simply change the ID to create one which is not existing? Let's hit execute. You can see that we have a status code right here, 204, which says undocumented. So it's like more or less non-existing, right? You can see 200 here. These here are no real values. You can see airline, string, etc. So this is like a template of how a possible success status code could look like. But our actual response is that one here, server response 204, and that's the one we have received. Now undocumented is not really nice looking. Just imagine you are developing a backend solution, a RESTful API, and the front-end developer, for example someone else, not only you, goes ahead and takes your API documentation and he now needs to know, okay, what happens if I get that 204, right? And he sees, okay, it's undocumented. So now let's go ahead, switch to our ASP project, which we have already opened in the background. And then we take a look on how we can really return status codes from our API endpoints. That's really important, and it definitely makes you one, and it definitely gives you some expert knowledge in developing RESTful APIs. So first of all, in our flight controller, search for the endpoint find, which is right here. Now we are returning a flight read model here, but we can adjust it. We can say that we want to return a status code, and we can simply do that by using the action result. So action result of type flight read model, right? So go ahead and use that type of flight read model, correct? So action result flight read model. Now an action result is our way to return a status code like 200, which would be okay, or 500 like bad request, or even 204 like no content. Let's do that. Flight single or default, but we need to wrap that, which is our result, right? So this would be a flight read model. We need to wrap that inside of an OK. And this OK method here, if we hold the cursor above it, you can see OK object result creates an OK object result that produces a status code 200 OK response. So you can see that OK means 200 response code. And as you know now, 200 means, okay, the request was successful and you can find the response value in the body. Okay, so we here have a problem. If we have an ID which is not existing, we cannot find any valid flight right here. Single or default will not return anything, so we have a null value. Now, we need to add more code, so let's go ahead and add some curly braces and get rid of that arrow statement or function that we have right here. Let's paste that code which I've just copied, right? So OK and all of this, that's fine. Let's modify it a little bit. Let's go ahead and first of all search in our flights. So var flight is equals to exactly the statement we have here. Now, let's do it like this. Let me zoom out a little bit. So here, as I said, we have a flight or may not, depending if the ID is existing in our database or not, right? So flight could potentially be null, and that's very important. So if the user enters an invalid ID, we will not have a flight. Now in this case, flight will be null. Let's go ahead and handle that. If flight equals to null, return a not found, and a not found, you can see this, if you hold the cursor above it, is also an action result or is a result, right? So we can simply return it. Action result and not found are working. And you can see that not found is status code 404. Now in every other case we have a flight and we can then simply go ahead and return an OK result, which is 200 status code right, and then pass in the flight in the response body. Now this looks pretty nice because now we have handled everything we need to take care of. We are sending back or returning an action result. So let's say we are returning a status code. If we have a valid flight, we simply return it, and if we don't find a flight, we simply go ahead and return not found, which is 404. Now let's save it and let's restart our application. Now let's try it out. Get to the flight endpoint, try it out to get a GUID like that one here, so that we really have a actual GUID. And now go to the flight, search flight endpoint, right, flight ID here. Let's again try it out, modify the value like 101 for example, just change the last digit and hit execute. Now what you can see here is you got error response status code is 404, and now we can actually see how it would look like. Now you can still see that it says 404 undocumented, but now we have a response body which is telling the other front-end developer, for example, or anyone who wants to use our RESTful API endpoint, how a possible response could look like and how he can use it to handle it or which data he gets from it. So that's very important. And now let's take a look on how we can get rid of that undocumented right here. So in our find method, you can see our HTTP GET attribute. And on top of that, we will add another HTTP, and on top of that, we will add another attribute. This time we use produces response type and then status codes dot status. You can see that here, and we search for 404, but you can go through that list and see a nice overview of what status codes are existing. Go ahead and use 404 not found. So now we go ahead and make that find method here return a 404 if we cannot find a flight. So let's see what this does. Save it, hit Ctrl F5 or simply restart the application on your own way. And when I go to the flight endpoint, paste in a GUID and simply change the number again, hit execute, you can see that it now doesn't say undocumented anymore. So this endpoint is producing a 404 error when we don't find a valid flight, right? So this is for sure only if we don't have a flight. If we have a flight, it's a 200 status code, which is including the flight as JSON format in the response body. Now, one last tip, you can, instead of write down status code status 404 not found, simply go ahead and just use 404, for example, because you can see here it's a constant integer and it has the value 404, which makes sense. So you can go ahead and simply write it that way. This is fine too. But if you want to increase the readability, you can for sure also go ahead and use it like before, writing it completely down. Okay, so far we have handled the OK and not found, right? So if I have a flight, then we send an OK. If we don't have a flight, we send a 404. So, but what happens if we have a different issue? For example, our database is broken later on, for example, and we cannot execute the single or default because Entity Framework, which we will cover later on, is completely broken, for example. Then this would produce a 500 result, which is bad request, because our connection, for example, is broken. Or what happens if the user is, however, sending some invalid input or sort of like this, so something where the user or the client is messing up with our program, right? So then we could go ahead and return a 400 error or maybe even his connection breaks or something like that. So we can return a 400 error. Now this is important when it comes to RESTful web API and not that much in MVC, but we need to take care about how the user, but we need to take care about what else but we need to take care about which other responses a user could potentially receive. So 400 and 500, server error and client error, let's call it that way, are also possible. So let's take a look in the next video how we can implement them too. Okay, welcome to this video. Let's continue with producing response, error codes and types in general. Now, I want to mention again that this is very important when it comes to planning and developing really professional RESTful APIs, especially if you want to make them public. You know, because it is like always in software development, you can get started pretty easy, but if you want to be very professional, there are additional information and steps you need to make. And making an API documentation, which gives really detailed information about what error responses are getting produced from a specific endpoint and which information you're getting delivered, is really important when it comes to professionality. Now, as I already said, right now here at find, and the same goes for search, we simply return that 404 not found here in find and an OK 200 status code if we have a flight. But there are still two sides who can fail. There's the client side and the server side. For example, client-side connection or server-side connection from backend to database. Now, in that scenario, we can go ahead and add two more attributes again. Produces response type here, produces response type. And then we can simply go ahead and say 400, which is bad request. We can copy it over, paste it again and say 500, which is internal server error. So this, the client side has sent an invalid request, okay, client side, and 500 here, the server has received the request, but was not able to process it. For example, due to a failure in the database connection string, for example, right? So this goes here, let's copy them both. Also for the search endpoint, because here the client side could fail and the server side could fail. So as you can already guess, most stuff for 400 and 500 appeals to every endpoint in your entire API. For now, let's simply start the application. When you open up Flight ID, for example, you can see that we now have 500 server error, 404 for not found, you can see it here, and we got that bad request, and none of them is undocumented. And 400 and 500 are completely new at all. Now let's take a look at the other flight endpoint. You can see that we also here have now 400 and 500. So just by adding those two new attributes, we have now in our documentation those response codes listed. If you want to go ahead and make that a little bit easier or increase the readability, for example, you can simply go ahead, copy that lines of code, both of them for sure, remove them totally, and if you want to make them available for all your endpoints, you can go ahead and add those attributes directly to the controller. So you could go ahead and say it like this, produces response 400 and 500. So you should only add that if you want to have that really documented in your API, for example. So 400 and 500, that would be pretty easy and reasonable to add, but for 200, for example, for status code 404, that wouldn't make sense for every endpoint, because not every endpoint is, for example, for finding data. If you have an endpoint for posting data, then a 404 not found wouldn't really make sense. Now let's take a look what happens if you restart the application. You can see that when I open up the endpoints, we still have those responses defined or documented here. So you can see this is also working. For now, I will remove them again and bring them directly to the actions itself, so not based here on the class, right? So the attributes, I will assign them to the methods and not to the class. Great. So if you get confused by, well, copy, pasting, etc., take a look at day 8 in the GitHub repositories commit. Now, in our documentation, you may have noticed that we have response like 400, 500, 400, 404, 500. But what about some documentation about an OK, so a success status code like 200, right? That would be one of the most interesting ones, because then another developer knows, okay, if I make a successful call, I will receive a response which looks like this. But right now he cannot see it. Right, because he will maybe not even be able to try it out because he has no access or whatever to try it out now, but maybe he still wants to build it and use it later on or whatever. But if I would be a front-end developer now and I got that API documentation, I would say, okay, how would a potential successful response look like if I make a GET request on Flight with an ID, right? So what will I get? I have no idea. I just know about 400, 404 and 500. So we should also take care about, okay, if you make a successful call, your response will look like this. And we can definitely make that very easy. In our project, go ahead again and add, who would have guessed, right? A new produces response type. And this time we go ahead and say type of. Now we simply add the type of actually the return type we want to show, right, in the response. So type of flight read model, and then we add the status code, which is 200. Now this is all we have to do. We go ahead and copy that, and we will go ahead and also do that here at search method, right? Because here the response type is also flight read model, but it's an IEnumerable. So we go ahead and do that. Take the IEnumerable flight read model, paste it in here because that's the data type that we want to return. Now let's save and take a look again. When we now open the endpoints, you can see that we now have a documentation for response code 200 success, and you can see an example value right here. So for sure this goes for both of them. And now our documentation is already delivering a lot of more information and value to other developers who have absolutely no clue about how our API is working, right? Great. So now you have become a better backend developer because you have understood the importance of documenting your API. We are building RESTful APIs because we want to deliver an interface for other programmers or for ourselves to write a program that connects to that API. And documenting is incredibly important, especially if you want to go ahead and find a job as a software developer, or if you are a software developer and you want to write professional APIs who are getting used by other developers, right? So you want to be a professional and not a beginner, and documenting RESTful APIs is definitely something what professionals are doing. Now, this is the side of backend, right? Or when it comes to response types. Now let's switch the side to client side and let's take a look on how we can handle those errors when it comes to Angular, for example. Welcome to this video. Now let's proceed and take care about some error handling. On the right side in the client app source app folder, open the search flights folder and go to the search flights component. Now pay attention, I'm talking about the search flights component, not the book flight component. So scroll a little bit down and check out this handle error here that we have just written. Now let's extend it a little bit more and then copy it over. So we can get even more information about that error we have right here by going deeper into that error object itself. Now we can do that by using, for example, console.log and then response error status is actually, there you go, error.status. So this, as you may have guessed already, will return a response code like 400 or 500 or 404. Now response error.status text is the actual message written like this. So now we have some more information logged to the console. The most important thing, however, is that it's attached to the search flight service here, to that method. Now we have done that by going into the subscribe method and adding it as a handler, as an additional handler. Now let's copy over that method. Copy it, go to the book flight component, paste it in. Now in subscribe, go ahead and edit this dot handle error. Okay, this is all we have to do. Now we have attached that handle error to it just as we did in the search flights component. Again, if you get lost along the way, simply go ahead and check out the Git commit so that you know what steps I have done here in detail. So the GitHub repository is definitely a safe place for you to make sure that they don't miss or screw up anything. Now we have logged a lot of stuff to the user, but that's not enough. We should definitely go ahead and if we cannot find a flight, right, because we're passing in an invalid ID, for example, we should go ahead and tell the user that we have nothing found. There is no flight, right? So now that you know that you can use that error object status, which is the status code, you can go ahead and say something just like if error.status equals to 404, it's an integer, you can go ahead and call alert and then something like flight not found. Well, if you don't know alert because you have no prior experience in JavaScript, alert is simply popping up a small window in your browser to inform the user about any notification. And right here we simply pass in a string, right? So if we have a status code 404, we simply show that alert. Let's go ahead and try it out. Start the application. Now let's search for flight. Let's click on book. So this is actually true because we have submitted the correct ID right here. Right, and in the moment, just to remember you again, in the moment we click on book, we will call that get endpoint and automatically submit the GUID of the flight. So every time we click here on book, we will have a correct 200 status code, which will actually lead us to the correct flight. Now, if we call that endpoint, we do that right here, right? This is the call to the endpoint. If we simply go to that page, you can see it always working because he calls our RESTful API endpoint, submits that GUID here, and he will find that flight. Now, if we adjust it like this 301, let me hit enter, you can see an alert popping up saying flight not found. And you can see the details that we have here at the card, let's call it card at least, is, well, not visible. There are no informations because we have no flight found. Now, if we click OK, you can still see that we are able to stay on that page, but that should not be a good practice. I mean, to be honest, even showing like data like this, so no data at all, right, just only icons and stuff like that, is not what we want to have. So, well, now that we know that we have no data, we should take care about redirecting the user automatically so that he is not able to stay on that site, for example, right? So we can add some auto navigation by using the router, and we will get to that just in a second. But I just wanted to make clear what's happening here. So we're loading that page, we get that alert because our RESTful API endpoint is not finding any flight with that GUID. So he will return a 404 response. We can see that if we open up the console, you can see that right here, status code 404, and then he stays simply on that site. And we will now take care about it and redirect the user because we are really caring about UX, right? User experience. And this, to keep it or to leave it like this, is not a great user experience. So let's continue with that. Welcome back to this video. Earlier we discussed that we can create links to other components just like this. I guess you just remembered that sheet, right? We use that a tag, router link attribute, and then we can redirect to a URL and providing some parameters. So to navigate to another route programmatically, you can alternatively call the navigate function of the Angular's router service in TypeScript. You can see this on the bottom left corner. This router navigate to book flight with some parameter like this one right here. The only thing that changes is that we are here, not inside of the HTML template. Instead, we are in the TypeScript. So in HTML, we can for sure use an a tag to redirect, but here in TypeScript, we make use of the router service. So now let's switch over to our project, and in the moment when we see an alert, which is saying, okay, I cannot find the flight, we will automatically redirect the user to our search flight page again. And it's really important that you understand how you can automatically navigate users, because often such a case is happening where something is, well, loading, or you're waiting for something, or on a specific error response, you want to forward or redirect the user. So let's take a look on the router service now. So here inside of our book flight component, where we have that error handling with the alert, right? We want to go ahead and use the router. We can do that from add Angular router. So here at activated route, we can also take the router service. Now for sure we need to go inside of the constructor. Here we have private route, activated route, and here we also add private router of type router. So now we can make use of the router service, and it's really a single line of code. Here when we have that alert flight not found, we can simply forward the user or redirect him to this dot make use of the router service dot navigate, right? This is what actually redirects the user, and then we can create an array, but now we don't need to proceed any additional parameters. This is why we add a single element to the array, which is search minus flights. So this is our path that we have defined inside of the app module. Let's real quick take a look. App module search flights, right? Now, okay, so there is no spelling mistake, that's fine. Here we have to add the slash and then the name of the path. So this should be working now. Let's test it. Let's start our application. And now when you're here on that page and we simply adjust that GUID to something which is not existing, you can see that flight not found pop up again. Now when I press on OK, you would estimate that you would get redirected. And you can see an error here which is saying cannot read properties of undefined, reading navigate. Now there is no issue with declaring or defining our router. There is another difference which I want to explain to you right now. So let's take a look at our project again. Here you can see everything seems to be implemented fine. This router navigate to that. That's great. The problem is, and you wouldn't expect that this method that we have right here is losing the reference to the constructor. So instead of writing a method, we will now turn that method into an arrow function, which is acting like a variable. To fix that problem, we will now turn that method here into an arrow function. It's pretty simple. Private handle error, and now we say is equals to, right? It sort of looks like a variable, error any, and now goes to. So here handle error is now part of the instance. That's the important part, and the instance knows this router. So because it's coming from the constructor, right? So we have to take care about the instance. So that's what's so important. Now that we can use this router, the router will no longer be undefined or null, and we can call navigate. So there is a difference between that method we had before and that new arrow function, which is keeping the instance or the reference. So let's take a look at our application again. When we now visit the page, it will automatically call or make the call again because of hot reloading. Let's click OK, and we now get redirected. So everything is working fine now. So there is one more video, which is, well, sort of additional, which is taking care about that arrow function and instance handling. So if you really want to dig deeper in that, check out the next video, but that's sort of optional. So if you are really in a hurry or in rush, you can skip it. But if you want to have the best knowledge and understand really everything, go ahead and check out that video. It's not that long and it has really a nice value. In the last video, we have created the arrow function which is actually keeping the information about the router because it's set in assignment time when we use that arrow function. So what you can see here is called an arrow function, and it's called arrow function because of its signature and typically because of the arrow right here. Now, TypeScript supports first-class function citizenship. It means that you can assign functions to variables or fields. You can pass functions to other functions around as parameters, as you can see right here. So function 2 is taking function 1 as a parameter, or even return them as a function result. So, for example, this is how you can assign a function to a variable. This is exactly what we have done in the last video, right? Afterwards, you can call the function just like a normal function. So there is, when it comes to calling that, no difference between a default function or method or an arrow function. Now, the this keyword in C# always refers to the class in which the method is defined. But in TypeScript, the value of this keyword depends on who calls which kind of function and how. For arrow functions, for example, this keyword is set at the time of defining the function. This is why we needed to make use of the arrow function to keep the instance of the router. So it's regardless of the object you call the function from, this keyword always points to the object in which the function was defined. So there is a huge difference between TypeScript this and C# this. Great, so now you have completed day 8 with some more additional information about arrow functions. I'll see you tomorrow in the next videos.